English translation 592nd Contact Sunday, the 27th of July 2014, 14:20 hours.
Here I am, Eduard, a little earlier than Florena told you last night. My greetings to you, dear friend.
Be also greeted, Ptaah, my good friend. It is good that you came somewhat earlier because, as you see here, I am working at marking all that in my depression book Warum der Mensch das wird. Was ist, Kampf den Depressionen, concerning Selbstliebe self-love, because actually Eigenliebe ego-love is meant about what I had written a clarification elsewhere. That is why we should correct the issue in this book. What would also be necessary for terms like Selbstnutzigkeit, self-interest, and Selbstbezogenheit, self-relatedness instead of Eigennutzigkeit, ego-interestedness, and Eigenbezogenheit, ego-relatedness, etc.
I think you can save yourself this trouble, because in Earth humans' language use, at least in the German language area, there is usually no difference between self-love and self-love. Accordingly, it should not be necessary to make any changes. And furthermore, what you have explained in articles and books is fully sufficient for those Earth humans who are concerned with spiritual teaching and therefore understand what is to be understood in terms of self and self. You have written everything according to the understanding of the general Earth humans, so that the whole is also understood in a correct way, and therefore changes are not necessary, which would probably only cause confusion. It should also be remembered that all these terms are those which are old-fashioned, and which probably cannot be changed to a new understanding.
Well, I will just give Bernadette a call. Good. Then I will leave it as you think it should be left. Then we can now turn to the work you came for. If you still have some time afterwards, then I would like to talk about something else.
That will be possible because in my time I am not the bell has rung.
I heard it, but now we are trying to work. It will probably be noticed if I do not go out, so I open the appropriate part of what we have to work on. Yes, here it is, then we can.
I notice that the person is still waiting outside the door. So you should go out and have a look.
Fine, I will go. It was Liesel. I told her that she had to wait until we finished our work. So we can start now. This time there are again 25 pages, which we have already worked through before, but for which you also wanted an encore and some changes, which I have now added.
Then we have already done what we have done today, so we can still turn to what you mentioned.
The time has come, but if you can still stay here and answer my questions. Then I want to ask you what I said in our last conversation, that with all the events on Earth and the behavior of the human beings, everything is getting worse, more precarious and worse. I would actually like to hear your opinion on this.
I did not really go into this when I was last here, but I would like to say the following. You spoke of the indifference and unkindness of Earth humans towards each other and towards nature, its fauna and flora, the climate, and the Earth itself. The truth that refers to this is that both the indifference and the unkindness of Earth humans are rapidly expanding in every respect, whereby the limits of what is still bearable have already been exceeded, and consequently brutality and unscrupulousness have also been able to develop in such a way that not even one's own well-being is taken into consideration, but rather that this is disregarded without hesitation by one's own or by external forces. This is done by destroying one's own life by one's own power, either by self-chosen suicide in any personal way, or by complicity, as is the case with suicide bombers who are fanatical, hateful, and radicalized by third parties in terms of their faith and lose all respect and honor for life. You have recently said that all these human beings are worse and far more primitive than the effective primitives who still live as so-called native savages and cannibals. And indeed you are right, for all those Earth humans and peoples who engage in hatred and jealousy, revenge and retribution, torture, murder and manslaughter, terror, the death penalty and war, whether for private, political, or religious or sectarian reasons, are indeed more primitive than the wild or semi-wild primitive peoples who still live far from any so-called civilization. The question must also be raised as to what civilization actually means, because what is called civilization today among Earth humans, states, and peoples has nothing to do with civilization. Because the Earth humans understand by it only the totality of the social and material living conditions created and improved by technical and scientific progress, but not what this term really means. What is to be understood by the terms civilization, note, Billy, from the Latin civis = citizen, civilized and civilized is what our Pleiadian understandings mean, which I would like to note in particular. A real civilization means a human society in which, beyond all barbarity and primitiveness, all social and material living conditions are created for the human beings in the same way and equally given to all, as well as a healthy and valuable development of consciousness and a comprehensive security of existence and life. This also includes a universally valid and comprehensive neutral peace and the explicitly established self-responsible, healthy freedom of the individual human beings and of each people who cultivate civilization, whereby these values are also cultivated towards other peoples outside of civilization. The whole is created and made possible by all conceivable technical, scientific and scientific progress, also by the economy, and by a policy which emanates solely from the people and is determined by them. Therefore, a real civilization of a people must also be characterized by positive and progressive living conditions, as well as by a distinctive administrative structure, and by a high level of conscious knowledge development and a high level of technical, mechanical, and medical development, which also includes a certain material prosperity as well as high cultural developments. Civilization also means that all human lives and all other life forms, nature and all that exists in it are generally and comprehensively respected and protected, and that consequently no acts of terrorism, torture, and the death penalty are practiced, and no acts of war are carried out. There is a generally valid and people-determining formation of states, which has no hierarchical social structures whatsoever, while also cultivating a high degree of urbanization and a very extensive specialization and division of labor, as well as the equality and equal rights of men and women. Urbanization, note Billy, Latin urbs = city is to be understood. For example, as a reasonable urbanization, but also as a reasonable expansion of the human beings and other life forms, in whose sphere of life the human being intervenes. So, on the one hand, urbanization can express itself in the reasonable growth of cities. On the other hand, it can be of particular value through positively changed behavior of the human beings in general, especially with regard to a healthy and valuable development of consciousness and the implementation of the creational natural laws and recommendations. Civilization also includes all conceivable civic virtues, as well as already mentioned, valuable cultural achievements and the important training of creational natural fair behavior for the human beings, as well as the manners of dealing with all life forms. What is called civilization on Earth today is of great evil and has nothing to do with a civilized existence of Earth humans and their peoples. All, in all countries and among all so-called civilized peoples, there is only an illusory civilization which brings only misery and need. Hatred, disadvantages, revenge and retribution, madness and damage as well as death, mourning and destruction to Earth humans worldwide. And if so-called peaceful civilizations, states and peoples of the Earth are also confronted with war and terror of any kind, then the human beings of these sham civilizations, which they truly are no different from those states and peoples who are constantly involved in uprisings, revolutions, terrorist activities, and acts of war. If the illusory civilizations, especially those that call themselves industrialized nations, are also involved in such conflicts, then the Earth humans who are involved act in the same degenerate, brutal, murderous and primitive and hateful way as the Earth humans of the other illusory civilizations, and consequently no difference is apparent. As the last 3 world wars, of which only 2 are ever mentioned, as well as the wars in Iraq, Afghanistan, Syria, and currently in Israel and Palestine also prove, as do the constant political and religious struggles and unrest in Libya, Egypt, and many other sham civilized countries. And it is also a fact that the world of thoughts and feelings of Earth humans is decaying more and more into degenerative forms. And consequently, the associated behavior is becoming more and more miserable and so blatant that very often the human emotions have no chance to make themselves felt.
Exactly, that is also my opinion. Besides what you have said, there are also those so-called civilized Earthlings who immediately take sides with one group or another or with a people, and who express their miserable attitude with outbursts of hate, brawls, insults, and threats. This, while they cheer the others whose side they take, as do-gooders, although they are not better, but equally degenerate, malicious, brutal, inhuman, criminal, and inhuman as those who are condemned with hatred and, so to speak, unpointedly stamped into the ground. There are also those states whose populations believe they are civilized. Just think of the warmongers, mercenary troops and criminal organizations such as the Mafia, the racist Aryan Brotherhood, and the Ku Klux Klan in the USA, whose murderous activities cause many deaths every year. This is also the case with criminal organizations in Mexico, Brazil, China, Italy, Russia, and Japan, as well as elsewhere where criminal groups and criminal syndicates, etc. exist. Furthermore, it must be said that the USA, which acts as the world's police force and vehemently advocates the death penalty, does not shy away from interfering in the affairs of foreign states, attacking them and waging war against them in order to further their internal disorder. The United States has been doing this criminally since the First World War of 1756-1763, which was truly global and involved almost all of Europe, and of course the United States with North America and also Asia. However, this worldwide war is misleadingly referred to not as World War I but as the 7 Years' War, even though America, Prussia and Great Britain, Hanover on the one hand, and the Imperial Austrian Habsburg monarchy as well as France and Russia and the Roman Empire, along with all the major European powers and small and medium-sized states of that time, were involved in the war conflict. Asia must not be forgotten, of course, because the war was fought in Central Europe, Portugal, North America, and India, as well as in the Caribbean and on the world's oceans. While Prussia, Habsburg, and Russia fought primarily for supremacy in Central Europe, Great Britain and France also fought for supremacy in North America and India. The whole thing, however, is misleadingly referred to, as I have already said, as the 7 Years' War, but not the World War.
And this despite the fact that it was effectively a world war and already for that time a very brutal and vicious war conflict.
Whereby the brutality, viciousness, and everything murderous and destructive increased many times over when the Second World War of 1914-1918 and the Third World War of 1939-1945 shook the earth and claimed many millions of human lives, although their exact number could never be determined. If one searches various sources, the maximum number for the 2 world wars in the 20th century is put at around 97 million.
Which of course is only an approximate ex post calculation. In our record, as I have just called up, there is a figure of 114,870,418.
It is only a difference of 18 million, but all of these were too many, and every death in a conflict is too many, whether it is due to rioting, insurrection, war or terrorism, delusional conflicts, the death penalty, jealousy, violent crime or quarreling, etc. Murder or killing in all these forms is just as uncivilized and illogical as the exaggeration of the massive overpopulation, whose direct and indirect degenerating machinations are slowly but surely not only destroying the entire planetary, natural and also man-made bases of life, but also irreparably destroying them in many ways. And when I think of your and my predictions, all these monstrosities have been increasing for some time now, But in this respect, this is only the beginning of what is to come. Also in relation to the migrations of peoples announced by the predictions, there have been for years and will continue to be for years to come, as well as the landslides, mudflows, landslides on slopes, the ever-increasing and more violent storms, flood disasters which are currently affecting Switzerland and large parts of Europe, with otherwise harmless streams becoming torrents. Volcanic eruptions, tsunamis, monster waves in the oceans and large lakes, and many other things that have been predicted have also been happening for years and are becoming more and more frequent and worse. And when I talk about monster waves, it is still the case today that every week 2 small or large ships disappear without trace in the oceans and large lakes. And as far as the oceans are concerned, there is also the seething catastrophe caused by the tens of thousands of tons of plastic and other plastic waste that contaminate rivers, streams, lakes, and mainly the seas. And the fact that these poisonous substances affect the health of the seas square kilometers and square cubic kilometers, causing countless marine, lake, stream, and river creatures to die in misery, is something that hardly any earthling would worry about, nor about the food that is sealed in plastic and other plastic packaging. When I think of what your father Svath told me when I was a young man, that all these packages, when they are used, which has been the reality for many years now, will claim hundreds of thousands of human lives, because these packages secrete hundreds of thousands of toxins into the food, through which many human beings begin to suffer from serious and sometimes life-threatening illnesses, such as all kinds of cancer. Then I dread what the future will bring in this respect. For me, the whole thing is nothing that I did not know in the 1940s, because even then your father Svath gave me some guidance in this respect, allowing me to look into the future and see what was going to happen in the present and the future. But when I sent the prophecies and predictions to governments, newspapers, radio stations, and various organizations, there was never any response. What Svath explained to me about future events, I have written down several times in different years and decades, mostly also in letters, which I sent as prophecies and predictions to governments and radio stations, etc., but also without success. So the prophecies and predictions quickly began to come true, and consequently the 1960s, and especially the 1980s, saw the beginning of the worldwide spread of the new epidemics which were also mentioned in the various prophecies and predictions, whereby the outbreak of the epidemics must be attributed to tourism and globalization. This is because, especially in the course of the last century, various species of insects, animals, and plants, as well as diseases and epidemics, have been spread all over the world by the transport of goods and travel activities, or by tourism by the earthlings. The spread of these introduced insects and animals is supported by a close relationship with the human beings of the earth, whereby their great adaptability promotes their survival and reproduction. Global climate change and the warming of the northern hemisphere, to which the degeneration and criminal machinations of the human beings with their overpopulation are themselves to blame, are also opening up further and increasingly northern settlement areas in Europe for the Asian tiger mosquito. Today it must be assumed that since then, just since the first predictions were made in the 1950s until today, there has been talk of some 20 serious new diseases and epidemics worldwide. The most important of these is AIDS, as well as the SARS disease, which I have read is caused by a virus of the corona family that damages not only the respiratory tract, but also the spine and spleen and the nervous system. It is also said to be constantly mutating and becoming more dangerous, resembling the so-called anthrax spores. Then there is also the new flu, which is actually called swine flu, or H1N1, as well as avian flu with the EH5N1 virus. Other diseases and epidemics are also important, such as dengue fever, which is spread by the Asian tiger mosquito. This is a species of mosquito originally native to the South and Southeast Asian tropics and subtropics, which is also responsible as a vector for diseases such as chikungunya fever, and is very important for the human beings in terms of health problems. Since the 1990s, this mosquito species has also been spreading in Europe from the south, And we at the Figu Center have also been able to sing a loud, sad song of their presence and poisonous bites for about 2 years now. Contrary to the assertions of Swiss entomologists and insectologists, who still claim that no tiger mosquitoes have been found in our regions, these creatures have been causing problems and mischief at the Figu Center for little more than 2 years. Especially last year they were in our center en masse. And also this year they were very active on warm days. And Cunio even had to see a doctor because he got serious health problems because of the bite of such a mosquito. Hartmut was also bitten by the mosquito, but he was helped by grease and ointments. But apart from your father Svath, you also explained a lot about all these things and unpleasantness to me, as I also know a lot from the news, etc. Such as that the so-called Marburg virus, which had already caused a lot of trouble in Marburg in 1967, also appeared as epidemics along with West Nile encephalitis. Tuberculosis is also on the rise again, as is the Ebola epidemic, as has been repeatedly reported recently.
The epidemic, which is also becoming an epidemic and ultimately a pandemic as a result of migration, tourism, and globalization. Unless all the necessary precautions and measures are taken without delay, in particular by preventing refugees and tourism in those countries where the disease has broken out and is already spreading.
It is unlikely to be listened to, nor will all the prophecies and predictions made and published since the early 1950s and up to the present day. The Earthlings are stubborn and autocratic and think they have fed the knowledge and correct ways of life and wisdom with shovel excavators. What has come out of this, however, is evident in all the natural disasters and in all the diseases, epidemics, etc., but especially also in the global terrorism, the acts of war and the uprisings, etc., which are not only political but usually fanatical, religious, sectarian in nature. Hatred of religion, foreigners, race, and nations has already become a global factor which can hardly be stopped because it is becoming more and more widespread and will cause a catastrophe in this respect. It is already clear that the migration of peoples in the form of waves of refugees from all over the world to the so-called civilized, industrialized countries, etc., will play a very important role in this process. The mixing of different cultures, religions, sects, and political discrepancies which has been caused by these migrations and refugee flows to foreign countries for a long time already, corresponds to a root of evil because it opened the Pandora's box, for which the first steps were taken decades ago. Although the ominous Pandora's box is a myth, it is a myth that must be translated into the reality of world and human events. But maybe it is interesting for some Earthlings to know what is behind this myth, which is probably why I should name it. According to Greek mythology, Hephaestus, the god of fire and the blacksmith or metal artist, created the first woman to be given the name Pandora out of clay on the instructions of the god Zeus. She was part of the punishment for mankind because Prometheus had stolen the fire. Epimetheus, the one who thinks after, the brother Prometheus, the one who thinks ahead, then married Pandora. God Zeus gave Pandora a large, closed earthen storage jug or wine jug falsely translated as a box, and told her that it was not to be opened under any circumstances. The jug had been filled by every Olympian with a special gift, all of which, except for hope, were perishable. Against the order of god Zeus to keep the jar closed, Pandora opened it immediately after her marriage, from which all vices and vices escaped and spread throughout the world. So she unleashed all the vices and plagues that were in the jar onto mankind. According to the myth, this was the time when evil and wickedness conquered the world, where mankind had not known evil, trouble, or disease, nor even death. The only positive thing in the pitcher was the hope that was at the bottom of the pitcher, and before this hope could also escape, the pitcher was closed again. So the world became an extremely bleak place, full of deception, jealousy, greed, hatred, disease, war, vice, lies, plagues, revenge, sectarianism, retribution, epidemics, addictions, crime, and slander, etc. The plagues were intended by Zeus as punishment for the human beings for the robbery of fire by Prometheus. He warned his brother Epimetheus never to accept a gift from the gods so as not to harm the human beings. Epimetheus, however, did not heed the warning, and beguiled by the beauty of Pandora, he married her. She later opened the jug again, and only then was hope also released into the world and allowed to spread. According to Greek mythology, this alone made it possible to fight all evil and all vices and plagues, in the hope of defeating them. With regard to Epimetheus and Prometheus, Greek mythology also tells us the following. Epimetheus, the one who thinks after, was the brother of Prometheus, the one who thinks ahead, who is considered a friend and cultural founder of mankind, and also the creator of the human beings and animals. If we look at this myth, we find it frighteningly illustrates what is rampant among earthly mankind, all vices and plagues of every kind. On the other hand, however, there is the hope that sooner or later the earthly humanity will become reasonable and free itself from all evil and negativity by symbolically locking and sealing all vices and plagues of the Olympians into the Pandora's jar or Pandora's box, so that humanity can finally live in love, freedom, joy, peace, happiness, and harmony. But if hope remains nothing more than hope, then it is probably the greatest evil to which the human beings of the earth have fallen prey. And consequently, hope becomes the greatest curse of humanity on earth, because it is endlessly tormented in hopelessness by all vices and plagues and by all other evils. But this hopelessness is still replaced and carried on endlessly by new hopes. And the agony of hopelessness will continue endlessly unless the vices, plagues, and all other evils which have afflicted humanity on earth are seriously fought and defeated.
What more can I say than that I can only confirm all your statements and statements? The Pandora's box was not really a box, but an earthen wine jug, and the whole mythological statement is, of course, based on an invented fable, just as it is in relation to Adam, Eve, and the serpent.
I know that, and there are also similar mythologies in many peoples around the world, about the creation of the first woman, and how all the evil and wickedness came into the world. But you also know this, because you have dealt with such mythologies, as you once told me in private. But now I am interested in how you see the poisons that are applied to plants, fruits and vegetables, and I am thinking especially of those poisons that are used against insects such as pesticides, especially the new poisons neonicotinoids. Not only do these poisons kill birds or reduce their numbers, they also kill benign insects and other life forms that are important for the survival of nature. Wild animals and domestic animals such as cattle, horses, sheep, goats, rabbits, and poultry, and finally also the human beings are affected by these poisons.
That is correct. In the narrower sense, pesticides are means of controlling insects and other pests, whereby these poisons are intended to kill, drive away, or inhibit annoying or harmful living creatures in their brood and in their growth or reproduction. It is a fact, however, that pesticides also kill or decimate benign and useful creatures to a large extent, and I must mention bees and birds in particular. The so-called modern pesticides, especially the neonicotinoids, are particularly bad because they drive bees and birds to extinction. Barn swallows and various species of sparrows are very strongly affected because these bird species in particular are very strong insecticides, especially with regard to insects that are specifically poisoned by the poison imidacloprid. However, finch species and other birds are also affected, which are slowly being eradicated by these poisons. It is also correct what you say with regard to the human beings and domestic animals, etc., because all the poisons, including all the neonicotinoids, enter the groundwater, the atmosphere, and the surface water, and consequently, by breathing the air and drinking the water, they enter the organism of all life forms. As a result, animals and the animals in the wild, as well as a great many human beings, become ill, including various forms of cancer. Since the use of imidacloprid since the mid-1990s, It is very clear how the insect venoms have already decimated a large part of the bee world, as well as benign and useful small and microorganisms and various species of birds in a harmful way. While it is also clear that this ongoing extinction in the world of birds and in the world of good and useful life forms is solely due to the action of the poisoned insects. If we look at birds alone, it is clear that they simply do not find enough food among the insects, which in principle do not need to be controlled as pests. If we look at the declining bird population, we can see that it is declining by an average of 3.5% per year. So it is clear that pesticides kill both harmful and good insects, and here I am referring in particular to neonicotinoids, which also include the poison imidacloprid. However, it is not only this type of poisons that should be mentioned, as there are several others, but neonicotinoids are among those poisons that develop their toxic effects almost exclusively in the nervous system of insects. Neonicotinoids are the main responsible for the mass death of honeybees and other flower pollinators. Neonicotinoids are also directly harmful to vertebrates, damaging their fertility, growth, nervous system, and also the immune system, up to and including many higher species, including birds, but also fish and mammals. And if you look at the fields and meadows, you can see that many are so densely planted that the light hardly falls on the ground. It is also evident that the massive use of neonicotinoids has undoubtedly also had indirect effects on the field fauna and the adjacent ecosystems for some time now. This is precisely because around 95% of the neonicotinoids are deposited in the soil and thus naturally also sink into the groundwater. It must also be said that these toxins remain chemically intact for up to 3 years, although it is of course also clear that these toxins cannot distinguish between good and bad insects. As a result, they also decimate the livelihood of many insectivores worldwide, with birds being the most vulnerable in this respect. So it is clear that there is a link between pesticides, insects, and the loss of bird species, benign and beneficial insects, and mammals and other animals. As far as pesticides are concerned, there are several hundred of them, each of which eliminates at least one or even several food sources of higher life forms, which are necessary for all fauna and flora. Unfortunately, Earth humans lack the technological knowledge of pesticides that are so specific that they do not have any impact on biodiversity. Ultimately, it is not just pesticides alone that are at stake, but specifically agriculture around the world, which is constantly intensifying in an unreasonable and unnatural way. As a result, fields, and meadows have been and continue to be so densely overgrown that no light can penetrate to the ground. As a result, fields, meadows, and acres are becoming hostile factors for birds. And the pesticides, which are a prerequisite for intensive forms of arable farming. Fields and meadows destroy the food supply of birds and various other important and useful life forms through the direct and indirect effects of the poisons. A definitive ban on neonicotinoids is therefore absolutely essential, as the problem of species extinction can only be solved by changing the way agriculture is run. Organic farming is one option, if not the clandestine introduction of pesticides and other toxins. In the end, however, Earth humans' wits and reason must inevitably take hold, and politicians and governments must take countermeasures and ban all pesticides and other toxins.
This is all clearly stated, but whether the Earthlings will act correctly in the future, I doubt it. But what I do want to know is what is happening with the EU, the US, and Russia. We have already talked a lot about this, and found that what the US and the EU are doing with their sanctions against Russia can have extremely counterproductive effects, and in the worst-case scenario, everything can degenerate into another world war. And all this only because the EU is greedily looking to Ukraine to have a direct outpost ahead of Russia, which it wants to arm with weapons.
What you say is correct, but we should not talk openly about these things again.
Understood. Then let us talk about something else. Black holes are, after all, supermassive formations of matter. They are both so-called galactic central suns, as you call black holes as the center of galaxies, but also drift through galaxies and even through free space. These formations are both small and large, or even gigantic, as I know from your explanations, but also from your father Svath, as well as from Asket, Quetzal, and Simyase, your daughter, because we have spoken about them on various occasions, officially or in private. Such black holes can have a weight several times or even millions of times heavier than our sun, which is said to have a quintillion of 989 quadrillion tons, as our scientists say. What interests me today is what actually happens or can happen when 2 or 3 black holes collide, which is possible, for example, when such formations collide in a galaxy or drift through free space. I am also interested in what can happen when 2 galaxies, and therefore also 2 black holes, collide, as will happen when the Milky Way and the Andromeda Galaxy collide, which will happen in about 3.7 billion years, as you say. A smaller galaxy, M33 as you once called it, is also supposed to be dragged into this collision. But what I am interested in is what happens when 2 galaxies with black holes, or so-called floating black holes, collide.
You are talking about the Milky Way and the Andromeda Galaxy. So first I want to say something important about it. According to our calculations, in about 3.7 billion years, the 2 galaxies will collide laterally, causing their outermost edges to collide, and they will become intertwined. After that, it takes about 100 million years, after which the process of collision creates new solar formations. The collision of the 2 galaxies also has the consequence that planets, suns, moons, and other formations are flung back and forth between the 2 galaxies as a whole or torn apart without colliding with each other. Many of them will take up new orbits, causing the 2 galaxies to expand but then merge after about 1.8 billion years, which may lead to the formation of a double galaxy. It is also possible, however, that the very large black hole of the Andromeda Galaxy tears that of the smaller Milky Way into itself, and a huge spherical galaxy emerges from this agglomeration. As far as black holes are concerned, which spin on their own as they drift through a galaxy or through space, it is quite possible that 2, or very rarely even 3, of such formations approach each other, collide, and merge. This always produces enormous masses of energy, through which gravitational oscillations are created, which move through the galaxies and through world space at the speed of light. If such events occur in galaxies, the gravitational waves may be able to cause a lot of trouble.
Thanks. Then once again I have a question about dark matter, which you call expansion matter. I was asked a question about what is meant by this. So I answered what you explained to me, that expansion substance is the universal gravitational force, which runs through the whole universe like a net, and forms knots and groups, in constant change. And if I myself have understood correctly what you have explained to me, then the entire network corresponds to an invisible gravitational energy, which attracts or forms and collects every form of fine matter, and at the same time expands or expands, from which material formations and even galaxies are formed, whereby in this respect the very energetic nodes play a particularly important role. So this invisible universal gravity net, especially its nodes, forms all kinds of fine matter, whereby this fine matter is not yet known to earthly scientists. The nodes are constantly widening and expanding, which ultimately results in visible matter that develops into galaxies. And because the dark matter expands in this way, you call it expansion substance, whereby the invisible matter develops and expands into nodes or visible matter, from which planets, suns, and whole galaxies develop over billions of years. Dark matter is not to be confused with the factor called dark energy, which corresponds to the universal centrifugal force.
This is correct, but this only corresponds to what I have explained to you, which you may also pass on. However, our directives do not allow me to explain more about this, because the knowledge of dark matter can hold many dangers for the earthly sciences, precisely when it is made useful and used for far-reaching destructive weaponry.
This is understandable, for the barbaric earthlings will be in a state of barbaric destructive fury for a long time to come, and will therefore immediately convert all knowledge and materials they acquire into mortal and destructive weapons. Therefore, I have also only explained what I have understood, knowing that the explanations are not the yellow of the egg, but only a superficial explanation. In the worst case, all the madmen of this world, the degenerate rulers and their vassals, would even blow up the earth if the means to do so fell into their blood-soaked hands. For all these mighty men are blind in their lust for power and domination, and they are not able to use their intellect, just as they cannot use reason. And when I talk about this, I come back to the EU and the USA, because this is also evident from all those power-hungry people in these countries who are foolishly imposing sanctions on Russia and who believe, mistakenly, that this would impress Putin and his supporters. In any case, I believe that Russia will not put up with these unreasonable sanctions and will take countermeasures, one of which could be to cut off the EU's gas supply or drive up the price of gas to such an extent that the people can no longer afford it. But there may also be other and even more blatant countermeasures which could have very bad consequences. I do not think that Putin wants to go to war with the EU, because I think he knows very well what is at stake if a war were to break out. But since Gavolt always generates Gavolt and sanctions are also Gavolt, it is very easy for acts of Gavolt to occur. But what they look like, and whether they actually come about, will be seen in the future. In any case, I think that Putin is cooler and more calculating than all the EU's power-hungry people put together. But I do not want to praise this man, because he too is obsessed with power. But he is also cooler and more calculating than all those in power in the EU and the USA, as well as those in other countries who follow the sanctions against Russia as a favor, so to speak, and who all act without thinking. Unfortunately, this also includes Switzerland to a certain extent, where at least the US and EU fanatics in government and among the people more or less go along with the EU and US sanctions, and thus care one hell of a lot about Switzerland's neutrality. The fact that they are thereby jeopardizing Switzerland's neutral reputation and possibly causing damage to the country and the people is of no concern to them in their stupidity and unreasonableness, which is hardly surprising when one considers that they are incapable of reason and reason. Unfortunately, those in government and among the people who think clearly and rationally are not able to do anything about it. The declarations, demands and opinions, etc. of the rational part of the population are simply hushed up and ignored, while the rational people in the government are booted out of the government and demonized. This is what was done with Christoph Bloscher, who dared to use harsh but true words against those who are of a different mind from the one required to maintain Switzerland as a state of peace and neutrality, not to shamefully betray and barter his homeland to the EU dictatorship, and not to make his own country an enemy of other states through unneutral actions. But precisely such enmities arise when neutrality is broken, and in some way dragged along with the sanctions of the EU and the USA, or otherwise politically unclean restraint or rejection is carried out.
Your frank and true words are not gladly heard by all those who are addicted to ruling and exercising power, and who distinguish themselves by a wrong political and non-neutral behavior. The fact is, however, that Switzerland must stay out of sanctions imposed by other states on Russia or other countries, because only in this way can Swiss neutrality be maintained. Politically or also in any other way, Switzerland can and must only play the role of peace mediator and provide humanitarian aid. And if I am to say anything else about Ukraine, its wartime conduct in its own country leads to the self-destruction of the state. And if the separatists lose their weapons against the regular Ukrainian army, there is a threat of Russian invasion, which constantly supplies the insurgents with new and modern weapons. In addition, volunteers are constantly being recruited in Russia to help in eastern Ukraine.
This is clear to me, because the truth is not recognized by all these elements, and consequently they slander me again and lie that I would politicize. Although this is not the case, because I only name given facts, and according to the Human Rights of the United Nations, Article 19, I cultivate my freedom of expression and information. In fact, the mere thought that I should have anything to do with politics is an abomination to me, because I am an honest and rational human being, and I do not want to be made a puppet by stupidity, unreasonableness, and false diplomacy. For my part, I value and appreciate my homeland, Switzerland, and I am grateful that I can live safely in this free and neutral country, and through its laws and regulations, etc., and that I can do my duty as a citizen and human beings. And this is also the case when wrong political decisions are made and implemented, and when certain traitors of both sexes want to betray and sell Switzerland to the EU dictatorship because their intellect and reason do not even reach the tip of their nose due to stupidity and foolishness.
Your opinion is known to me, and it honors you, contrary to those whom you call traitors to their homeland. Because to have a country as one's homeland, as Switzerland is in terms of freedom and neutrality, should be appreciated even by the most stupid. But now, dear Eduard, my friend, my duty calls me again. Florena or Anjana will inform you about the next correction work, which may be on the 2nd of August. Goodbye, Eduard.
Goodbye and take care, Ptaah.